Story 1. Being a park ranger is a passion of mine. I love the idea of being out in nature just as much as I enjoy helping others connect with it. I've been doing this job for about 14 years and am originally from Texas, working in various parks around the state. I've been blessed to be able to do what I love ever since finishing college. In all my years of doing this job, I've seen a lot of things, some strange, some scary, and many quite the opposite. In fact, many were quite beautiful. I've always been a believer in the strange and paranormal and have never been much of a skeptic. It's hard to be one when you've grown up the way I did. When I was little, my mother would often say she'd find me talking to my grandmother, who had died 3 years before I was born. That is more for background context, though, and not something I will get into deeply. Instead, I'd like to talk about October of 2007. I was working in Central Texas, and around this time we started having some odd happenings around the park. The first really strange encounter involved one of our dogs, basically a park mascot of sorts named Sally. She started rushing off and would always wind up in the exact same area, an open patch in the forest. Once there, she would begin barking toward the sky for about 5 minutes before stopping and acting normal again. This behavior continued for a week. It was a Wednesday morning when Sally ran to that same spot in the woods. I remember it vividly because upon arriving, I saw several other unfamiliar dogs in the area, and they were all barking in unison toward the sky. This was strange, but 5 minutes later, they stopped. By mid-October, this behavior stopped abruptly. There were no more strange gatherings of the animal kingdom or anything that seemed out of the ordinary. That was until near the end of my shift one day. When I thought I saw someone out of the corner of my eye, I looked closely around the area, but quite simply couldn't find anyone. So I headed to the station to clock out. I was the last one out that day because my boss at the time was on vacation. Looking back, I wish I had been on vacation as well. What happened next was unnerving, to put it lightly. One of my coworkers came to me the next morning upon my arrival at work and complained about a woman who wouldn't stop staring at her. My first thought was that maybe it was a homeless lady, but when I asked for a description of the woman, she sounded like she was straight out of another timeline. She wore a black bonnet and an all-black dress. She looked dressed for church and seemed to carry a Bible. That was strange, but I thought maybe she was a Bible thumper. They exist everywhere, and some of them can be quite judgmental. However, my coworker seemed genuinely scared, which was strange because she wasn't easily startled. I told her I'd go with her, and we would check out the area where this woman stood. We headed up, and to my shock, we found ourselves in the exact same spot where the dogs used to gather, in the center of this tree line. There stood a woman, clear as day, matching the description given to me by my coworker. I approached the woman and asked her why she was staring down my coworker. The woman didn't say a word, and that's when I noticed her eyes. The eyes of this woman were pure black. It was the darkest black I have ever seen. As I looked into them, I felt the need to cry. I am not sure why or how to explain it, but before I knew it, I was crying and completely overcome with emotion. I wasn't just crying normally, I was crying hysterically, and my legs felt like jelly. I soon fell to my knees and began crying more. I'm not sure how to help you realize how strange this whole situation was. The more I cried, the more the woman stared. At first, her face was stone cold, but after a time, as I cried more, I saw a smirk grow across her face. All sorts of confused. I tried to stop, but I couldn't. It wasn't long before I noticed some of the dogs we had previously seen suddenly form up around us. The dogs were growling, I was crying, and my coworker was screaming bloody murder. It was a strange feeling, and I'm not sure how to justifiably elicit to you the things going through my mind. I couldn't control my actions. I couldn't think straight. There was just an unending sadness. Before I knew it, the dogs were barking and growling at us, at least, I think they were. It was at this point I felt so out of it, and things were so dizzy that I began to notice I could no longer perceive whether I was awake or dreaming. At the height of my sorrows, everything went blurry. The next thing I knew, a jogger was waking me up. I awoke with a startle and asked for my coworker, who was still asleep next to me and freaking out in her sleep. I did my best to wake her up, and after a while, I took her back to the station after thanking the jogger. The jogger seemed to want an explanation, but I was so confused and worried that I didn't give one. I just left after saying thanks. I remember my coworker felt quite hot. I felt her forehead, and she was burning up with a fever. I called an ambulance, and they took her to the hospital, where she was kept for the next few nights. My coworker was eventually released, but she quit immediately. I tried to get her to stay and even tried to get her to come back, but she just wouldn't. She didn't answer any of my calls after that, and last I heard she moved out of state. I don't know how to explain this woman or the things that happened to my coworker and me. I will say there have been quite a few times when people up in that area have been found passed out cold or babbling to themselves. I feel that area is cursed in some way, as that's the only explanation I can truly come up with. I know that barely makes much sense, but then again, what really does anymore? Was this woman a ghost? Some sort of demon? Is there some sort of plausible and sensible explanation for it? I'm not sure of anything anymore, nor am I sure how to explain the odd behavior of the dogs either. I still work with park services today, but I refuse to work at that park any longer. From what I understand, no one has turned up dead in that area. But in my honest opinion, something is wrong with that place. Story 2. Hello, you can call me E. I worked with the park rangers for about 10 years before moving out of state and into a different profession. I don't know that my story is necessarily scary, but it is strange. I won't specify where I was working at the time other than to say that I worked in the Midwest when this all happened. I will say I really enjoyed my years as a park ranger. They were wonderful, and in this case, a bit strange. The oddity began when I was doing my morning patrol and found what looked to be a painted angel on a tree. Now, it was oddly well detailed. If this had been painted on a canvas instead of on one of our beautiful trees, I wouldn't have minded. But because it was on one of our trees, I had to take some photos and write up a report to give to my supervisor. I scoured the area and found no sign of paint or anything. So, figuring it was either an artist or some sort of vandalism, I filed my report and went about my day. About 5 hours went by when we were approached at the station by someone freaking out. She explained that she had found a jogger lying dead next to a tree with an angel on it. I wasn't freaked out by this, but I did find it strange. I followed the woman to find that it was the very same tree where I had been earlier. The paramedics arrived soon after, and it was later on that I discovered the elderly man had died of a heart attack. All right, that's weird, but I believe in coincidence, so I just figured it was one of those odd but unfortunate things that sometimes happen in life. A couple of months went by, and I had forgotten all about the older man and the painted angel. Once again, while wandering our parks, I noticed yet another painted angel. This one was not on a tree, though it was on a bench. It wasn't large or anything. Unlike the first one, this was a smaller angel. I was a little thrown, but my mind being the way it is, I decided it was probably some person who was inspired in some weird way by the art and saw the story in the paper. The next day, a young woman was found lying at the bench. We thought she might have been sleeping, but upon attempting to wake her up, she was found to be dead. The reason for her passing was quite explainable, though. She was shooting up heroin and had come there overnight to do so. The final cause of this woman's passing was an overdose, but they didn't think it was a suicide. I mention this because she was sitting right on top of the angel painted on the bench at the time of her death. The initial thought was that the woman had painted it herself and then committed some weird, ritualistic suicide. But this was ruled out when the cause of death was reported later on. Police, and to be honest, we rangers were completely perplexed as to how this was happening or why. Who was painting these angels? And why would someone die at every place one was painted? It created a bit of conversation, but as a year passed without any other deaths or incidents, people kind of just let it go, myself included. It was around Christmas of the following year that the strangest one happened. This one didn't actually happen in the park I worked at the time, but at a church in the town where I worked. Another angel had appeared. It was painted in red, as always, on the back of the church itself. Knowing how the previous incidents occurred, people grew naturally curious. The angel that was painted was much larger than the others, and above the head and wings were the words, "May they know peace." This was the first time a message had appeared with an angel, and every attempt to remove the angel was futile. No matter what was used, it remained there. Having given up, and with nothing happening over a couple of weeks, people pretty much thought this one was a crank and the others were a coincidence. That was until one Sunday, when the church was having a service and a big lunch that afternoon. During the prayer and worship service, some of the members were prepping the food and the stoves. The stoves were gas, and upon ignition, a leak caused an explosion that killed everyone inside instantly and burned the church to the ground. After this, we never saw another painted angel or any other kind of strange symbols around town. This was the final one, and all three had predicted death or deaths of some kind. I'm not sure how to explain that rationally, but it was such a strange sequence of events that I felt the need to share it. Who was painting the angels? Did they know these souls would die? Was it a warning, or was it simply a strange priest memorial? Well, I'm sure we'll never know. Story 3. In New Jersey, most people will talk of the Jersey Devil, especially when working in the park department as a park ranger. Though there are other things I've seen in my brief 5 years that I think are far stranger. Everything from your typical ghost sightings in the area to tales of strange people who watch from the tree line or the edges of the woods. All that aside, what I want to talk about is my encounter with what I believe to be a hellhound or some sort of spiritual animal. My story takes place in October of 2016. We were prepping for a Halloween event and some tours we like to do from time to time in the area. These tours include walks through the trails that we decorate to be spooky for kids and young teenagers, talks of local hauntings, and all-around general spooky fun. Things these tours aren't supposed to include would be sightings of actual ghosts or me running for my life. I'll get to that, though. The early part of this incident mostly included seeing a dog in the distance. I always saw it at night, and during the tours it seemed to follow and watch. I'm not sure of the breed, but it was all black and huge. I've never seen one so big. It was my first time seeing this dog. I tried to get its attention, and it just stared at me. If I tried to approach it, the thing would simply turn and run away. It didn't seem to be threatening, so I eventually just let it be. I'd occasionally check to see if it would follow, and I'd see it and think nothing of it. About mid-October, I remember noticing on the tour that night that I didn't see the dog that usually followed us. We were about midway through the tour when a woman began screaming. Those on the tour were naturally startled, as the scream was loud and sounded like someone was in unbelievable peril. I took one of my co-workers, who we'll call Randy, and we rushed to go after the source of the screaming. It wasn't long before we found a person lying on the ground in pain. We pulled up to a woman, bleeding and screaming hysterically about her husband being dragged off by a massive black dog, and that it had mauled her, but grabbed him. Once we got her to slow down, we were able to make her make sense. It seemed this dog came from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. The woman described something completely unbelievable. She said she saw this thing dragging her husband into the woods, and both it and her husband vanished into thin air. I was quite skeptical about this and figured her mind was playing tricks on her, and maybe the amount of stress was causing her to hallucinate. I fully believed the dog existed, as I was pretty sure it was the one I had been seeing, but I thought maybe her panic had caused some hysteria and made her remember or see things that might not have happened. I'm not a psychologist, but that was my initial theory for what happened. At least, this is what I believed until Halloween night, when we had our biggest celebration. I saw that dog again during the tour. It was the first time I had seen it since the woman reported being mauled by it. The thing looked larger than last time, and I felt much more afraid than I had previously. The entire aura around the thing had changed. The best way I can say this is to say that the first time I saw it, it seemed harmless, but on this night it felt off. It felt like this thing was staring into my soul. I continued the tour, constantly checking behind me as I did, and eventually I noticed the dog didn't appear to be around anymore. The rest of the celebration went well, and once all the festivities were over and most of the cleanup was done, I told my boss I'd stay behind to lock up and clean up what was left. They asked if I was sure, to which I reassured them that I was, and I wasn't tired anyway, so I'd pass the time. Everyone went home at this point, and I was the only person left in the park. I spent about an hour cleaning up and was just finishing throwing out the trash and locking up the station when I went toward my vehicle. It was there, right in front of my truck, that I saw this thing. It was no longer in the distance. It was straight in front of me, and I'm positive it wasn't there a moment before. It was strange how quickly this dog appeared, and even stranger how scarily huge it was up close. I remember feeling a choking feeling as the dog stared at me. I felt like the life was draining from my body. I remember turning and trying to head back for the station, but as I did, I heard a large bark. The bark didn't sound normal at first. It was quite deep and not entirely like a dog bark. I fell to the ground out of fear and loss of feeling in my legs. At first I remember thinking, I need to get up or I'm going to die. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted for the station, unlocked it, and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. I remember the door shaking as this dog slammed against it. I looked around the office and eventually found a flare gun. I grabbed it and aimed it at the door, waiting any second for this thing to just blow through. Not even a moment later, the door began caving in off its hinges, and this huge black dog stared at me, growling and walking closer. I panicked and fired a flare off that hit this dog and set it ablaze. I then ran for a back entrance, busted out the door, and ran with all my might for my truck, screaming as I reached my truck and jumped in. I locked it, turned the key, and fired up my truck in time to see this dog on fire rushing toward my truck. I hit the gas and ran into the dog, which damaged the front of my truck. Thankfully, I believed I was safe once my truck bounced over the body of this huge thing lying on the ground. It was only a few seconds later before it began to spasm, that it soon stood up on all fours. I could hear its bones snapping as it headed back in my direction. I was freaked out and ran deeper into the woods. I began screaming my lungs out for help as I ran. I could feel that draining feeling growing within me. My thoughts were clouded and my vision began to blur as I ran and forced myself to call out. It wasn't long before I was unsure if sound was coming out, as I screamed and heard nothing. I was exhausted, but hightailing it deeper anyway. The only thing crossing my mind at this point was that this thing was chasing me, and if it caught me, I was dead. There would be no ifs, ands, or chances. I just prayed and screamed, even though I could not hear a sound, and I kept running. I figured I'd keep going till I collapsed or was dragged to God only knows where by that thing. I was quite sure I was going to die when I saw lights ahead. I thought faintly I heard someone asking if everything was all right. I was waving my arms when I heard a gun go off and felt a bullet go by me. I heard a yelp as I fell to the ground. There was a sheriff, and I was too exhausted to speak out. I remember feeling sick and throwing up. There was a low growling and then a loud bark before everything went silent again. When things went silent, I felt my vision and hearing return to me. The sheriff took me to the hospital, and I checked out shortly after, perfectly fine other than some scrapes from my falls. I don't know what that thing truly was. I suggested a hellhound, but I'm not sure, to be honest. I've refused to work the Halloween event since, and to my knowledge, there haven't been any more sightings or deaths from that dog. At any rate, that's my story, and I was wondering if anyone had a clue what this thing could have been. I'm grateful to have not seen it since, but it also opened my mind to a realization and possibility that things exist out there that we simply can't explain. I am grateful to be alive today, and I pray to never see that thing again. Story 4. I've only been with the park rangers in Northern California for just about 3 years now. During that time, though, I had the most amazing thing happen to me. When I joined the rangers, I was somewhat ill, but I wasn't quite aware of this fact yet. I was also in desperate need of a job and beyond grateful to the park rangers in my town for taking a chance on me. I showed my gratitude by being as upbeat and enthusiastic as I could about my work. I had been a heavy smoker for many years prior to this, which gave me a bad cough that I didn't really think much of as I had had it for years. Before the events that follow, I was always a very skeptical soul. I'd argue I still am to a degree, but all that said, I have no earthly explanation for what happened to me. To start out, about 6 months into my time with the park rangers, I began to notice that my cough was taking a mean turn, and on top of that, there was blood in my phlegm. This startled me the first time I noticed it happening, but because I needed the job and didn't want to let my coworkers down, and because I genuinely loved the job, I tried to brush it off as not being a big deal, maybe just an allergy thing. So I continued working until a Friday evening about 3 days later, when I was cleaning up before heading home. While taking the trash out to the dumpster, I had a brutal coughing fit. All I remember from it was coughing, struggling to breathe, feeling dizzy, and then waking up in a hospital with my boss and 1 or 2 coworkers standing around the hospital room. I'm a guy in my late 40s now, so when this happened, I was closer to my mid-40s. I say this to give you an idea that my body wasn't exactly in prime shape, especially with smoking since I was around 12. I spent the next day or 2 in the hospital, and as time went on, I was eventually given the harsh truth of life. We all die someday, somehow and somewhere. I was told I had lung cancer, and it had progressed far enough that my odds of survival or living a lengthy life were pretty much non-existent. I'll admit at that moment I was upset. I was very angry and pissed off at myself for my stupid life choices. I was angry at whatever higher power there may be because I felt like they were screwing with me. Here I had finally found something I absolutely loved doing that also paid the bills. Here I had finally found balance in my life after searching for so many years, yet after all that, here was some sick joke being played on me. Now that I had found balance, I was being told that I was not going to be around much longer to enjoy that peace of mind. I became dejected, and quite honestly, I just didn't care anymore. I told my work what was going on, and I refused to just sit around and die. I couldn't exactly work in the heat of the day very well, but with supervision, I was allowed to work a later shift as long as I took it easy. There was another night guy, and night work wasn't really all that hard. We basically patrolled the area to make sure it stayed clear of the homeless from about 5 p.m. to about midnight, and then went home. While on these late-night patrols, one of the places we checked was by the lake in our park. This was a pretty awesome area, and even had a path with stepping stones leading to a small island with a tree. While doing my patrol one night, I was quite sure I saw a woman loitering by the tree. She felt different. She wasn't threatening, but I couldn't just let her chill by the tree. Unfortunately, the park was closed, and it was time to go. So, being the cranky, sick guy I was, I hollered over to this woman. "What in the 9 hells are you doing out here, ma'am?" The woman looked up at me and smiled. I remember her vividly. She had a shorter haircut, not shaved or anything, but neck-length hair that didn't quite reach her shoulders. I remember a warmth coming over my body as she smiled. She looked like she was wearing a white gown, and she seemed very much real, or so I thought. She wasn't translucent or anything. She looked as real as your hand would to your face. My point being, she seemed like another human like you or me. I noticed she wasn't really leaving the island, so I reiterated to the young lady that it was time to go. About that time, I heard Hank, the guy who supervised me, come around the corner and laugh at me, asking who I was talking to. I felt insulted in a way, so I turned back and told him, "The woman? What are you, blind?" Hank just laughed harder and asked, "What woman?" I turned back and was about to point her out when I noticed she was gone. I asked Hank to check behind the tree for me, as I didn't have the strength to cross the stone walkway. He checked and assured me there was no one around. I looked perplexed and then shook it off before telling him I must need sleep. He told me not to worry about it and that we'd better head out. Hank was my ride at the time, as I was advised not to drive myself to and from work due to my condition. After dropping me off, he left, and I promptly went inside and crashed. As I slept, I found myself back at the lake. The woman I swore I saw earlier was there. I knew I was dreaming, and yet at the same time, none of it felt like a dream. She held her hand out silently, and I remember a feeling of hesitation and fear. Despite being sure I was dreaming, I felt so weak and was afraid to try to cross to the island. I was sure I'd fall somewhere along the way and drown. That's when I heard her voice. "Come," she said. "Join me." Before I could refuse, a warmth came over my body again. I stepped forward slowly and shakily. With every step I took, I grew shorter of breath. Things felt dizzy and hazy, and yet through my blurred vision, she simply stood there, gown blowing in the wind, smiling at me. She seemed so assured and confident that I would make it. So I continued onward, and before I knew it, I made it to the island and fell to my knees, begging for air. I felt like I was dying. So some part of me knew I had to be dying and waking life. I felt a hand place itself on my shoulder and another underneath me. I felt an honest-to-God strange feeling. And then this woman looked at me with a wider, comforting smile. I felt in that moment that perhaps she was a personification of death, and this was my time. I felt okay with it, I just wanted to let go. She shook her head no, as though she read my mind, and lowered herself to my level before leaning in as though she was going to kiss me. She stopped short and blew visible air into my open mouth. I felt this air go into my lungs, and for a moment I fell to my knees and vomited a black, bile-looking fluid. I continued to vomit, and as I did, I felt her hand touch the top of my sweaty head. "It's going to be okay," she said. At that moment, I vomited up a huge glob of black fluid, and I felt a seed fall out of it. Suddenly, I could breathe again and felt better than I had my entire life. I looked up in confusion to see her smiling, and then I woke up. I shot out of bed, confused and sweaty. I was shaky and checked my temperature. I had a fever of 102, but I took something and went back to sleep. I woke up 13 hours later, shocked to find my temperature was normal. I felt hungry. I could breathe clearly, and I just felt all around better. I rehydrated, called into work, and took the night off. The next day, I went in for a checkup. In that moment, the doctor looked at me in shock and told me I was cured. I didn't believe it and asked him to check again, but he laughed, assuring me I was going to be fine. He explained that the cancer that had stricken my lungs was non-existent. Now it had seemingly just disappeared, somehow. He and I both just stood there in stunned shock, and he asked me to come back in a couple of weeks to do some double checks. I did this every 2 weeks for the next 3 months to be safe, and I was fine. I was cancer-free. I'm still working today, happy and healthy as can be. I still offer to work nights from time to time, and I quite often frequent the tree on the island. I haven't seen the woman from there or in my dreams since. I'm aware of how crazy it all sounds, but this experience has led me to believe in a higher power of some kind, and in angels. I honestly have no other explanation for my miraculous recovery. I am thankful for every moment I have on this earth and no longer take a single moment of any day for granted. Story 5. The scariest thing I've ever experienced in my entire life was while I was working as a park ranger in Canada. I only did it for a year, and the reason for this was because of the weird stuff going on where I worked. In Canada, We have a lot of forests and a lot of mountains. Where I was working, you'd often hear loud noises in the distant mountains, and I was always told it was a sasquatch. I thought this was said in jest because I've never really believed in that sort of thing. And the guys and gals I worked with were known to be jokesters who spun tall tales. One of my supervisors mentioned a story to me about a time when he was working, and his truck stalled out in the mountains. He said it was snowing so hard you could barely see in front of you, and he was forced to abandon the truck and head back the way he came on foot. According to my supervisor, he followed the sounds of a sasquatch until he made his way back, as he couldn't quite tell where he was due to the blinding snow. Eventually, he made it back to the station and was able to take another truck to pull his stranded truck out later when the snow died down. I was skeptical of this story and let him know it, but he would always chuckle and say that I didn't have to believe in anything for it to be real. Anyway, I wanted to share that to explain some of the things that were believed in the area I worked in, at least believed by my coworkers. To get back to the point at hand, I'll explain the day I thought I'd be a smartass and show up my coworkers. This was also the last day I ever worked there. It wasn't that I was fired. It was because I quit after my experiences. I was asked to work in the mountains and help clear the trails of some snow in the area. I agreed and made an offhand remark about how maybe I'd see a sasquatch while I was up there. My supervisor got the weirdest grin and simply mumbled to himself, saying, "Perhaps you would." About 5 hours into clearing some of the snow with the plow, I heard that sound I typically heard in the distance. Very funny, I thought to myself. That thought didn't last long, as I quickly felt something slam hard into my snowplow and flip me off the embankment, sending me tumbling a few feet below. I won't lie, I straight up pissed myself at that moment because it was so sudden and the fall freaked me out. I wasn't expecting this at all, and I struggled to get my mental faculties together. I heard this disturbing sound that I couldn't possibly begin to explain. I'm not sure how to fathom it, but I can say it scared me out of my wits. I began screaming, but the snow had picked up heavily at this point. A very sudden blizzard, which was not entirely unusual for the mountains, but it wasn't in the forecast. It was completely unexpected and random, but I guess that's how blizzards are. It wasn't long before I could hear nothing but heavy footsteps plodding through the snow. I tried my radio, but it was of no use in the snow. I was getting no signal, and I was terrified. I quickly hid near my overturned plow, only to hear heavy breathing. Whatever was out there was huge, much bigger than anything I was aware of existing in the area. As I stood motionless, I felt something drip on my coat and face. It was saliva, and as I looked up, I saw a massive set of teeth. I was at a loss and shaking, not just from the cold, but from the absolute terror I felt. I kept thinking, this is it. This is where I die. I closed my eyes and prayed. I don't even believe in God, but I prayed anyway, hoping beyond hope for a miracle. Then I heard a loud smashing sound, and an inhuman, unexplainable noise roared from behind with such force that it shook the overturned snowplow toward me. My best guess is that whatever it was let out a yelp of pain, judging by whatever hit it. Seeing pieces of ice, I pondered if something hadn't struck this thing with a large block of ice. Whatever was in the snow turned its attention away from my direction, and that's when I heard the Sasquatch calls. I didn't believe it was really Sasquatch at first, but as I heard one call, there were suddenly others. I wasn't sure what was happening, and I couldn't see very well, but I was quickly grabbed by a large set of hands and placed back up on the embankment where my truck was initially launched from. I then followed the calls, and as I did, I could hear fighting off in the distance. I didn't wait around, and I didn't ask questions. I just continued following the calls until I saw my supervisor close by, shouting for me. I scrambled to him, freezing cold and terrified out of my mind. I was brought back to the station where I explained everything. He had that same cheeky grin and asked, "Do you believe us now?" I wasn't sure what to believe, but I knew something dangerous was out there. I struggled to collect my thoughts and asked him if he had heard anything else out there. Something massive. He said he hadn't run into anything other than a sasquatch. He said he'd keep an eye out and asked if I'd be okay as he handed me some hot cocoa. I was shaking, and I told him I was quitting. He seemed taken aback at first, but as he read my face, I think he could see that whatever attacked me had bothered me greatly. He didn't fight me on it and told me to list him as a reference. He said he'd help get me somewhere more my style, and that he appreciated the work I had put in up until that point. I was always a hard worker, but that experience, well, it was the last day I ever wished to be out there. I've never been so terrified in my whole life. If I can tell you two things for sure now, it's that I believe in Sasquatch, and whatever attacked me was definitely not a Sasquatch. Story 6. You can call me Jimmy, and I am a park ranger who has been working in this profession for roughly 12 years now. I want to share a story about some caves in the area where I work. We've had people go missing in this area for quite some time now. I know that's not exactly a strange occurrence in an area with caves, but there's a bit more to it than that. You see, oftentimes near nightfall, people will say the entrances to some of the caves appear to have voices echoing from them. This has led those of us who work in the area to nickname them the Dead Caves. Now, that is just something those in our department use to describe these strange caves and their phenomena. It isn't really something you'll likely hear locals or tourists use, at least not to my knowledge. It's a pretty spooky thing, as I've obviously looked into this myself on a few occasions. And yes, it does indeed sound like voices coming from these caves. That would be strange enough. But the thing that is stranger still is the fact that the voices sound quite real. It's as though someone were standing right at the entrance, calling you inside. It's eerie. Anyway, this has caused some trouble from time to time, but for the most part, people generally leave the area alone. And before you ask, no, we don't run tours of the caves. So it isn't anything like that. Even if we did, we wouldn't be doing them near nightfall. At any rate, I suppose I should get to the point. This story is very personal to me. My nephew went missing in these very caves a few years ago, and this story is about the time I assisted a search and rescue team to try to help find him. I suppose this story could fall under your search and rescue or park ranger stories, as I am a park ranger, but feel free to use it for either. That out of the way, my nephew had been missing for a little over 24 hours when we began our search proper. The last place we knew him to be was at the caves in the area. Right out of the gate, something seemed off. His gear had been found abandoned at the entrance. This was definitely his gear too, as he always kept a sack with his name stitched into it. So if he lost his gear, or as was the case here, went missing, whoever happened upon it would know who to look for or whom to return the lost gear to. It's important to note that my nephew and I had gone spelunking together on many occasions, and he had even gone a few times on his own. He wasn't new to this, and he was plenty capable of making his way through a cave, new or old, completely alone. So the fact that his gear was left at the entrance was strange. Our initial thought was that maybe something happened and he didn't actually wind up in the cave itself. As such, we had everyone who was certified to do cave search and rescue continue canvassing the area throughout the rest of the park, while our team continued deeper into the caves. Caves are generally dark places, and sometimes this can lead people to seeing things. What I'm about to tell you, I assure you, wasn't just my imagination. While searching the caves, we could hear screaming. The screaming sounded a lot like my nephew's voice, but it was a cave, so we couldn't be sure. I shouted for my nephew, but when I did, everything fell dead silent. It was while panning the area with my light that I saw something rush out of the corner of my eye. It looked like human feet. I quickly pointed out what I saw, and we proceeded in that direction. When we got to where I had seen it, though, there was no one there. I began to grow deeply worried. The screaming we had heard earlier sounded horrific. The kind of screams you would likely hear if someone were being tortured. This spurred me and the search team to look faster. We searched for hours, and when we didn't turn up anything, we were getting ready to head out for the day, as night would be coming soon. Almost as though something or someone were listening, we heard a very distinct voice. It was my nephew's voice, and he seemed to be crying and asking for help. We called out in response to the voice, but all we heard was a continued plea for help. It was like a tape being played over and over, repeating the same broken help before eventually stopping altogether. This made us push forward with the few hours we had left to search somewhat safely. I remember frantically scrambling and internally praying my nephew was okay. As we continued our search, though things were becoming less hopeful, we found one of his shirts in the cave. It was torn pretty badly and had blood heavily soaked into it. It was at this point I remember reeling in worry and feeling the tears begin to well up. One of the members of the team asked me to fall back, and I tried to fight them on it, but they were right. I needed to take a moment to step back, and part of me was afraid that I might find something I didn't want to see. The search continued for another few weeks, and no matter how hard they searched, they never found anything else outside of identifying clothing. Nothing that would lead us to my nephew. Some things really bother me about this whole search, outside of the obvious pain of hurting for my missing nephew. Why was my nephew's gear at the entrance of the cave? Another thing that bothers me is, if his gear was there, how the hell did he get so deep into the cave itself? Finally, where did he go? Caves are vast, massive structures, and there's a strong chance he's still in there somewhere, or his remains are. It has become obvious as time goes on that he is no longer with the living. That is a reality my family and I have had to accept, that he is gone. It still hurts typing this out, honestly. I wish I had answers as to who or what brought him that deep into the cave. I still work in the area, and we still don't have any answers. Sometimes, though, I swear I hear his voice when I stand at the entrance to the cave. Whatever happened to you, my nephew? I pray you are in a better place now and resting peacefully. Story 7. My name is Elizabeth, but you can call me Liz for short, and I've been working for the Park Ranger Service for a little over a year and a half. Because I've been working there for such a short time, and because I'd rather no one know where I work or the area I live in, I won't be sharing that information. I wish to share an experience I had while working a job I still love today. To get to the point, we have a rather large park ranger department, so I'll admit it was a little overwhelming when I first started there. That said, I quickly became friends with one of my shift partners, whom we'll call Martin. We talked, laughed, and always found a way to pass the time, even during more mundane shifts. I felt comfortable talking to him, and I'll admit I may have had a bit of a crush on him as well. That said, I'm a professional, and I kept our working relationship just that, professional. It was a Friday, and we were all going home when another one of my coworkers pulled me aside and asked if she could talk to me for a second. I'll call this girl Clary. Thinking everyone was pretty cool so far, I figured I'd chill for a moment and chat with Clary. The entire time she talked to me, she was nervous and fidgety. I asked if she was okay, but she just kept nodding. I smiled and told Clary I had to get back, but if there was anything she wanted to say, I could stick around for another minute or two. That was when she asked if I wanted to go to the bar and have a few drinks. She went from super nervous to oddly calm very quickly, and began talking about how she was rather bored on weekends and didn't know too many people in the area. She just wanted someone to chat with whom she felt she might be able to relate to, or who could give advice, that sort of thing. I think in actuality, she felt more comfortable talking to another woman. Also, I'm only 5'4", so I'm probably not that threatening, at least. That was my thought process behind what she was thinking. I told her I had no plans, so sure, we could meet up and hang out. Later that night, I was getting ready to head to the bar when I stepped outside for a moment to smoke. Yes, I know it's a terrible habit, but I love it. So save your judgments for someone who cares enough to quit. Anyway, as I was lighting up a cigarette, I looked down and noticed the tires on my Ford Explorer were flat. Looking more closely, I noticed all 4 tires were flat and looked as though they had been slashed. Now, feeling a little unsettled, I looked around, but I saw and heard no one. Slowly, I stepped back inside and locked my door before calmly calling the police. I put out my cigarette and explained how I was going to head to the bar, but found my tires had been slashed. Dispatch said someone was on the way, so I waited. It took them a bit to arrive, as I live pretty far out in the middle of nowhere, and it generally isn't a quick trip to my place, especially from the sheriff's station. Upon their arrival, it dawned on me how strange things were as a whole. There didn't appear to be any vehicle tracks or anything leading up to my dirt driveway other than my own. Now, someone could have been on foot or very careful about covering their tracks, but again, I live way out in the middle of nowhere. After the sheriff wrapped up his report, I called Clary. I had all my coworkers' numbers in case of a work emergency, and they had mine, and explained the situation. She was bummed, but she then asked where I lived and offered to pick me up if I still wanted to go out. I explained that I appreciated it, but I really didn't want to go anywhere after everything that had happened, so we both agreed to go out another night. It took me a while to fall asleep, but when I finally did, I slept hard. The next morning, I got up and had some coffee and a cigarette. As I was sitting there, Clary called and asked if I wanted to go out next Friday, even offering to pick me up from work next time until I could get my tires fixed. I thanked her, and we agreed on it. Saturday night rolled around, and I was about to head to bed when I heard a loud bang. It wasn't persistent, but it was like someone hauling up and hitting my front door as hard as they could. It was enough to take me by surprise and make me leap 5 feet in the air. I grabbed my gun and headed for the door. I ripped it open and aimed outside. It was completely silent. No one appeared to be around. I noticed some minor damage to the door, but nothing that would tell me who or what had hit it. I shut the door, kept my gun nearby, and locked up for the night before heading to bed. It wasn't long before I passed out. The events up to this point were strange, but I'm not easily scared, so it didn't take me long to get to sleep, whereas I'm sure a lot of people might be bothered a bit more by it. Plus, I had my gun. Anyway, the rest of the weekend went by with no strange happenings or odd goings-on. Monday morning, I was up early and ready to head out with Clary to work. I asked if she could come with me when I had my car towed after we got paid. She agreed, and on Wednesday evening, we got my car fixed. Clary and I were getting along really well by this point, and I was grateful for her. We started discussing our Friday plans, mentally ready for the weekend, and decided we'd hit the bar and see where the night took us from there. Thursday was here quicker than ever, and I had come in a little early to help with the inspection of the national park. I was doing my morning routines, and I had Clary and Martin with me. We were all chatting and enjoying our time when we suddenly heard a loud pop, and one of our tires blew, causing me to lose control of the truck and crash into a tree. I checked to make sure everyone was okay, and once I verified that we all got out to look around. It appeared the tire that blew had something lodged in it. It was like razor wire, but looked much more primitive in its creation. It was a rope with some kind of blades embedded within it. This was strange and made us all feel uncomfortable. We tried to radio the station, but we were the only ones on shift at the moment. Our boss would likely be there within an hour or so we couldn't do much but wait or head back without the truck. Knowing this, Martin, Clary, and I just kind of chilled for a bit and kept an eye out. We began discussing what happened based on what we pieced together, and we were beginning to feel a little uneasy, as whoever had placed the trap had done so intentionally. That much was obvious. This made us all on edge, and we decided right then to try and walk back to the station. It was while walking there that things grew quiet. Too quiet. There wasn't any real sound, and even the wind wasn't moving. We tried shaking it off and continued on. A few minutes later, We heard what sounded like our boss's voice. Our first instinct was to head toward the voice, but as we got closer, it sounded more distorted. Something didn't feel right, and we weren't exactly sure what it was. Our boss likely wouldn't have come out to find us so soon. And even if he had, something in the voice was really off. It was almost like something was mimicking his voice. Weirded out, we continued onwards and tried radioing the station again, just in case our boss had gotten there early, but there was no response. I looked at my watch and realized our boss should have gotten in by now. I figured we would give it a few more minutes and try again. That's when we noticed the stench of rotting meat. Nausea hit me quickly, and that's when I saw something that turned me ghost white. There was a tall, emaciated figure with a skull for a head staring down at us. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of weird art, but when it turned its head to look at us, I knew we had to run, and fast. We did just that. As we ran, we heard the thing drop off the hill and come after us. The three of us felt terrified as we pushed forward, when Martin suddenly stopped. I stopped, turned, and asked him if he was stupid. He gave me this forgive me look and ran in a different direction. The thing that was chasing us quickly followed in his direction. I remember screaming Martin's name while Clary frantically got on her radio and called the station. We got a response from one of our coworkers asking if we were okay. They sounded just as frantic as we tried to rush back to the station. When we arrived, several sheriff's officers were cordoning off the area. Our boss had been attacked by what the police said was likely a bear. He was alive, but he looked terrified. I quickly explained to the sheriff that we had been attacked in the woods, and then explained how Martin split from us and lured the thing that attacked us away. I tried to plead with him that it wasn't a bear, but they thought maybe we were delirious from shock. I remember how angry I was, but I don't blame them for not believing what we saw. With all that said, they did immediately start a search, as they did believe we had been attacked. Sadly, Martin was never found. He still hasn't been seen or heard from in days. I honestly believe he's dead. That sounds grim and really messed up, but what other explanation do you really have? I'm working in a different area now, but Clary and I are still friends today. We miss Martin, and if you take anything from this story, please remember to be safe out there. There are things out in the woods and in this world that we can't explain. I don't wish anyone to ever go through what my boss, Clary, and I have, and I sure as hell wish for no one to ever wind up like Martin. Story 8. My name is Erica, and I'm a 32-year-old park ranger who's been with the park rangers in Alaska for 10 years now. I really enjoy the frontier feel of Alaska and how much of it isn't really touched by man, or modern man at least. There are a lot of woods and mountains, and it's a great place to live if you are someone who likes to mind your own business and be away from people. There are plenty of places here that make you feel like you're just in heaven, and I would recommend living right here if that's who you are. My story takes place in December while I was working on the job. I was enjoying nature in the cold while killing time near the end of my shift. I had finished everything I needed to do for the day, and then some, and I didn't have a real excuse to cut out early, so I figured I'd drive around and kill some time while I waited to pass the final hour of my shift. It was while doing this that it began to snow, and I'm talking sudden snowing that wasn't forecasted. It was hard enough and windy enough that I couldn't tell what direction I was headed in, or if I was still headed straight at all. Because of this, I decided to slow down and stop the truck. I couldn't really step out, as it was too cold and windy at the time, and I figured if this snowstorm was so sudden, it was likely to blow out just as quickly as it had arrived. This extremely optimistic position of mine was slowly ruined as the hour passed, and I was supposed to be back at the station clocking out. I tried to radio back, but the weather was too powerful, and all I could get on the truck radio was static. Figuring there wasn't much to do, I hunkered down and just thought about snuggling up next to a warm fire later that night and how nice it would feel once the storm finally passed. About an hour went by, and I still couldn't get anywhere. I was beginning to get worried now, as this was a strong and sudden storm, and as such, snow had begun to accumulate to the point where I might not be able to get out before long. I decided I'd stay in the truck, however, as going outside would be suicide, and this was the warmest place I could be. Another hour goes by and I try to radio again, but I get nothing. I'm beginning to feel the fear welling up in my stomach. I'm not exactly prepared for the weather at hand. I'm dressed warmly, as it is Alaska during the winter, but I'm not prepared to be out here for a long period of time, nor was I expecting to be. Part of my mind calms itself down when it sets in that they have to be looking for me. My boss wouldn't leave if I hadn't clocked out, and I wasn't in an area where they wouldn't be able to find me. But again, the snow is vicious in its fall at this point, and maybe they're unable to search for me properly. Another hour goes by, and I try the door. I can't open it. The snow has begun to bury my truck, and now I'm really starting to become fearful for my life. It is getting dark, not that I can tell the difference in the storm itself, and it dawns on me that I might have to spend at least the night out here. I try to radio one more time, but it's all static. The storm is interfering with everything, and I find myself unprepared and without any sign of aid coming. It isn't long before I hear a loud thud against the passenger side door. I jump at first and call out shortly after, but I hear nothing in response. I then hear a roar that sounds similar to a bear. I begin to panic, but I stop and remind myself that the bear doesn't know I'm in here for sure, and it isn't likely to get inside. I can hear it jump onto the front of my truck and climb on top. I hear it sniffing around and then roar one more time, before I feel it drop off the back of the truck, and soon after, it leaves. The truck shakes as the weight of the bear is relieved from it, and soon everything falls quiet once again. It isn't long before it is 10 at night, and I am beginning to shiver from the cold. I'm still unable to open my door, and I'm quite sure the exhaust pipe on the truck is buried. Because of this, I don't want to turn the truck on for fear of carbon monoxide poisoning. I instead curl up and try to conserve whatever warmth I have while waiting for help to arrive. I am cold, unprepared, and hungry. I'm afraid I may die out here, as it is extremely cold, and I'm not sure if I can stay warm enough to even survive the night. Eventually, I drift off into a half-sleep. I still remember the dream, because I was dreaming I was warm next to a nice fire, and I couldn't have been further from my actual situation mentally. I am awoken at about 300 or 400 in the morning, and it dawns on me that I feel like a popsicle. At this point, I can't feel my toes or anything else, for that matter, and there's the sound of something mechanical going on outside. I can hear voices, and when my brain finally catches up, I feel myself filled with relief as one of the voices is my boss. They found my truck. The storm had subsided, and they were digging me out. I wound up being rushed to the hospital, where I was treated for several things, one of which included losing my pinky and ring finger on my right hand due to frostbite. I made a full recovery otherwise, but I did spend a little while in the hospital and on paid leave while recovering. I'm alive, and I'm grateful for that every day.